Long before a single bottle of modern perfume existed, women rubbed whale vomit on their wrists. They wore secretions scraped from the glands of Himalayan deer. They distilled monsoon rain from baked river clay. They burned the infected heartwood of a tropical tree, so rare that only 2% of specimens ever produce the resin. They soaked 7,000 rose petals in olive oil by hand and started over the next morning. The story of how women smelled good before perfume is not a story about primitive hygiene or crushed flowers in a bowl. It is a story about the first chemists in history, who were mostly women, about trade routes so profitable they carved entire cities from sandstone, about empires that burned more incense than their own treasuries could afford, and about a single technological invention perfected in Baghdad around the year 1000, without which no bottle of Chanel, no Dior, no modern fragrance would exist. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back, way back, to Egypt. By the time the first pyramids rose at Giza, Egyptian women were already steeping flowers in oil, grinding tree resins into wax, and burning a sacred incense whose name has survived 4,500 years. They called it kapet. The Greeks later spelled it kifi. The recipe, still carved into the walls of the Edfu temple from the Ptolemaic era, lists 16 ingredients meant to mirror the 16 dismembered pieces of the god Osiris. Raisins, wine, honey, frankincense, myrrh, mastic, pine resin, sweet flag, cinnamon, juniper berries, and 6 more. Priests added each ingredient while chanting. The mixture aged for days in copper cauldrons before being shaped into pellets and burned at sunset in every temple in the country. Plutarch, writing centuries later, said the scent could lull you to sleep, quiet your anxieties, and brighten your dreams. He compared smelling it to listening to beautiful music, but kaifi was temple incense. What Egyptian women actually wore on their bodies was something different. After their daily bath, they anointed themselves with perfumed oils whose base was not olive oil, like the Greeks used, but the lighter, more delicate balanos from the desert date and moringa, both sweet and slow to go rancid in the Egyptian heat. On top of those bases, perfumers layered the most prestigious scents the ancient world ever produced. Succinum, a lily perfume, cyprinum, made from henna flowers, stocta, a concentrated myrrh tincture, and the queen of them all, Mendesian, manufactured in the Nile Delta city of Thmuis and praised by Pliny as what we might call the Chanel No. 5 of antiquity. In 2019, Egyptologist Dora Goldsmith and classicist Sean Coughlin actually reconstructed Mendesian from a Greek medical manuscript. Myrrh, cassia, cinnamon, pine resin, and balanos oil. The reconstruction was exhibited at the National Geographic Museum in Washington, D.C. People who smelled it described it as strong, spicy, faintly musky, and unusually long-lasting on skin. That's a 4,000-year-old recipe, still holding up. Now, the woman everyone asks about. Cleopatra VII did not just use perfume. She turned it into an industry. Mark Antony gave her the balsam plantations of Judea near the Dead Sea, where archaeologists later uncovered a 1st century BCE perfume factory at a site called En-Bouquet with 9 separate production rooms. Balsam of Judea was worth literally twice its weight in gold. Cleopatra also controlled the Mendesian perfume works at Thmuis and wrote an entire book of cosmetic recipes, now lost. But the moment that defines her is the river Cydnus at Tarsus in 41 BCE. Plutarch describes it. She sailed upriver in a barge with a gilded stern and purple sails. Silver oars kept time to the music of flutes and harps, and the perfumes from her vessel spread across the water to the shore. The crowd in the city square abandoned Mark Antony sitting alone on his tribunal and followed the scent to the riverbank. She defeated one of the most powerful men in the Roman world, with fragrance before she ever said a word. You did not have to be Cleopatra to participate. Theban tomb paintings show ordinary Egyptian women at banquets holding the blue lotus to their noses. That's Nymphaea caerulea, the sacred water lily with psychoactive alkaloids that was both a symbol of rebirth and an actual perfume. On their heads sat the famous cone-shaped objects that Egyptologists debated for decades. Were they symbolic? Real? In 2010, excavations at the ancient city of Amarna finally answered it. Real wax cones, found on skeletons of non-elite women. Even working-class Egyptians adopted the scented headdresses of the wealthy. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to roughly 1550 BCE, preserves a wrinkle cream of frankincense, gum, beeswax, oil, and cypress kernels. A modern dermatologist would recognize every ingredient. And the archaeology keeps delivering. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, sealed alabaster jars inside still smelled fragrant. 3,245 years after they were last touched. Chemical analysis identified spikenard, imported from the Himalayas. A small flask inscribed with the name of Queen Hatshepsut, now stored at the University of Bonn, was CT scanned in 2009. Dried perfume residue at the bottom contained frankincense, almost certainly from Hatshepsut's legendary expedition to the land of Punt in 1471 BCE. She sent 5 ships down the Red Sea and returned with 31 living myrrh trees, the first documented foreign tree transplant in history. Visitors to her temple at Deir el-Bahari can still see where they were planted. Egypt perfected the art of wearing scent, but the woman who gave us the earliest surviving recipe for making it lived 500 miles to the northeast in a hot palace kitchen in Assyria. Around 1239 BCE, early May, in the 5th year of the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I, a woman in the royal palace at Ashur produced a perfume for the king. Her recipe was copied onto a clay tablet, baked hard in some later fire, and then forgotten for 3,000 years. German archaeologists dug it up in 1903. It is now catalogued as Car 220 at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. The text opens with a single line identifying the author as Tapputi Belate Kalim. Tapputi is the oldest named chemist in the historical record. Not the oldest perfumer, the oldest chemist, period. Her tablet describes a multi-day process. She heated aromatics in water, filtered the solution through cloth at dawn, washed crushed cyperus rootgrass with myrtle and calamus, added balsam, lit a fire under a covered vessel, cooled it with water, and then removed what the scribe called the distilled and sublimed substances from the trough. That is the oldest written description of a distillation still in human history. The finished product, 16 liters of aromatic salve, infused with myrrh oil, balsam, calamus, and cyperus, was noted at the bottom of the tablet as fit for the king. Beneath her recipe on the same clay tablet sits a second formula by another female perfumer. Her name is partially destroyed. Only the feminine ending, Ninu, survives. The difference between being remembered as the mother of perfumery and being a footnote in history was a crack in a 3,000-year-old piece of clay. The popular story of Tapputi as some kind of feminist scientist entrepreneur is not really accurate. She was a palace servant working over open fires in an Assyrian kitchen, lifting heavy vats of oil, chopping wood, filtering scalding liquid through cloth with her hands. Perfume in the ancient world was not born in a laboratory, it was born in a kitchen, and the kitchens were staffed by women. The Hebrew Bible echoes this centuries later when the prophet Samuel warns Israel that a king will take your daughters as perfume makers, cooks, and bakers, 3 trades named in the same breath. Mesopotamian palace records confirm that women were sometimes specifically enslaved for perfumery and cookery and sent to royal workshops. Egypt built the culture of scent, Tapputi gave us the technology. But neither of them could have predicted what would happen when that technology crossed the Mediterranean and landed in the hands of a civilization obsessed with the human body. The Greeks did not invent perfume, but they did something nobody before them had thought to do. They put different scents on different parts of the body, and in doing so, they turned fragrance from a religious ritual into something much more personal. Around 300 BCE, a man named Theophrastus of Eresus, who had inherited Aristotle's school in Athens, called the Lyceum, sat down and wrote the world's first surviving book about perfume. He called it Concerning Odors, 69 sections covering everything from base oils to spice blending to the strange fact that your nose stops noticing a smell after a while. He observed that perfumes keep best in stone or metal containers, that lighter scents like rose and lily suited men, and that heavier, longer-lasting blends of myrrh, spikenard, and marjoram were, in his words, the best for women. But Theophrastus was documenting something that had already been happening for 1,000 years before he picked up his pen. The Mycenaean Greeks were making perfume on an industrial scale during the Bronze Age. More than 1,000 clay tablets written in the script called Linear B, excavated from the palace of Nestor at Pylos, destroyed around 1180 BCE, list perfumers by name and catalogue their ingredients: coriander, sage, rose, saffron, fennel, cyperus. The job title was Aliphazuz, which translates to anointer. A full millennium before the Parthenon was built, Greeks were already mass-producing fragrance. What the Greeks added to the Egyptian tradition was an idea that sounds obvious now, but was genuinely new. They decided scent should be worn on different parts of the body, not just burned in a temple or rubbed uniformly on the skin. The comic poet Antiphanes, quoted centuries later by the writer Athenaeus, mocked a wealthy Athenian man who soaked his feet in Egyptian unguent, rubbed thick palm oil on his chest and jaw, dabbed mint extract on both arms, spread marjoram on his eyebrows, and finished with ground thyme on his knees and neck. That is comedy. But comedy only works when the audience recognizes the behavior. Real Athenians did this. They mapped the human body in fragrance 2,300 years before the modern perfume industry invented the idea of top notes, heart notes, and base notes. The perfumes themselves had origins and reputations like fine wines. Rose oil, called rhodinon, came from the island of Rhodes and the cliffs of Phaselis. Lily perfume, succinon, was imported from Egypt. Henna flower oil, kyprinos, came from Cyprus. Iris perfume was a specialty of Corinth, and the greatest of them all was Megaleion, which translates simply as the Great One. A blend of behan oil, balsam, calamus, camel grass, cassia, and resin that required continuous decanting during cooking. It was sold in tiny decorated vessels exported across the entire Mediterranean. The alabastron, the arybalos, the lekythos, names that sound like minor Greek gods, but were actually just perfume bottles. In the 1990s, scientists applied gas chromatography to surviving Corinthian flasks from archaeological sites. Most of them contained olive oil scented with pine and juniper resin. That is the key detail. Even relatively middle-class Greeks could afford some kind of fragrance. The rose, the iris, and the myrrh stayed with the wealthy. But pine-scented olive oil was available to nearly everyone. Around 594 BCE, the Athenian lawgiver Solon actually tried to ban men from the perfume trade. The reason is still debated. Some scholars think Athenian farmland was being converted from grain fields to flower crops and threatening the food supply. Others think Solon, like many later Roman moralists, simply associated perfume with softness. Either way, the ban failed. Perfume was too deeply woven into Greek life to legislate away. By the time of Sappho of Lesbos, scent had become a language of desire and memory. She wrote of anointing yourself with precious and royal perfume, of satisfying passion on soft beds. The goddess Aphrodite herself was thought to literally smell of rose oil, anointed by the Graces with heavenly fragrance. And in a 2025 study, a researcher named Cecily Bronze at the Glyptotek in Copenhagen demonstrated that Greek temple statues were actually perfumed by their worshippers. A temple of Athena in the city of Elise reportedly had saffron mixed directly into the wall plaster. The interior stayed fragrant for 500 years. Then came Rome, and Rome did what Rome always did. It took a Greek idea and scaled it until the treasury started screaming. Pliny the Elder, writing his Natural History, calculated that the Roman Empire spent 100 million sesterces per year on perfume and Eastern spices. Adjusted loosely, that is somewhere around $1 billion. Pliny was disgusted by this. He wrote that perfumes serve the purpose of the most superfluous of all forms of luxury, that unlike pearls or clothes, unguents die in the very hour when they are used. Nobody listened to Pliny. A single pound of premium Roman perfume cost 400 denarii. That was nearly 2 years' pay for a legionary soldier. Julius Caesar's personal scent was a blend called telinum, made from olive oil, sweet flag, fenugreek, honey, marjoram, and yellow melilot. Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, bathed every day in the milk of 500 wild donkeys, scented with perfume. After Nero kicked the pregnant Poppaea to death in 65 CE, he held a funeral so extravagant that, according to Pliny, he burned more frankincense in a single ceremony than the entire annual production of Arabia. Roman women's beauty routines survive in a book by Ovid, called Cosmetics for the Female Face, the only ancient cosmetic treatise written explicitly for women. Ovid lists recipes including Libyan barley, vetch, 10 eggs, powdered hartshorn, narcissus bulbs, and honey. Modern analysis confirms that most of these ingredients, the egg whites, the oatmeal, the wheat germ, are pharmacologically sound today. And then there is the detail nobody forgets. Roman women bought the sweat scraped from gladiators' bodies after combat. Trainers collected it with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, mixed it with rose oil, and sold it as an aphrodisiac face cream. Pliny and Galen both confirm this. It was not cheap. The Roman day revolved around the bath. A woman would enter the changing room called the apoditerium, move to the anointing room called the untorium to be rubbed with perfumed oil, work up a sweat in the exercise yard or the steam room, have the oil and grime scraped from her skin with a strigil, plunge into the cold pool of the frigidarium, and then receive a fresh anointing with even more perfume. The baths of Caracalla in Rome held 1,600 bathers at once. Perfume shops clustered on a street called the Vicus Unguentarius, Perfumer's Street. And in the city of Capua, the great perfume market called the Saplagia supplied roses, considered the finest in Italy. When Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in 79 CE, it preserved a working perfume garden at the House of Hercules, complete with rose root remains, perfume bottles, and a joke scratched into the wall near the entrance. Crass credo, tomorrow we'll have credit. To feed this appetite, camel caravans crossed the Arabian desert. Pliny measured the route at 1,200 miles, 65 stages, and 62 days. Roughly 3,000 tons of frankincense per year moved from the kingdoms of Yemen through the rose-red city of Petra to Mediterranean ports. The Nabateans carved Petra from solid sandstone on the prophets. Spikenard traveled from the Himalayas, cinnamon from India, balsam from Judea, saffron from Cilicia. The Roman taste for smelling good built a global trade network 1,700 years before the British East India Company existed. Rome was importing scent from India and the Himalayas. But while Roman women were bathing in donkey milk and gladiator sweat, Indian women were doing something Rome never managed. They were distilling the actual smell of rain hitting dry ground. And a Mughal empress was about to discover rose oil floating on the surface of her bath. In the Indian medical tradition of Ayurveda, fragrance is not a luxury. It is its own medical category, called Gandha, with up to 10 formal classifications. The physician Charaka, writing in the 1st or 2nd century CE, prescribed daily perfuming as a moral duty. His phrase was Sumana Sugandhi Shat, let one be cheerful and well perfumed. The Sushruta Samhita gave instructions for aromatic medicated oils. The Ashtanga Hridaya prescribed cool, pleasant, heart-soothing fragrances as part of the daily routine. And in Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra, the 19th of the 64 arts that every cultivated woman was expected to master, was Gandhayukti, the art of preparing perfumes. By the 6th century, an astronomer named Varahamihira had written an entire chapter of his encyclopedia, the Brihat Samhita, on the mathematics of perfume blending, not the poetry, the mathematics. He designed a combinatorial permutation system using 16 base substances chosen 4 at a time. A 2021 paper in the Indian Journal of History of Science calculated that his formulas generate 28,392 possible perfumes. This was early combinatorial mathematics, and it was being applied directly to scent in India 1,000 years before Europeans used the same math for anything. The ingredients were staggering. Sandalwood, the sacred chandan, was the foundation of nearly everything, applied as a tilak on the forehead to activate the third eye, anointed on temple deities, daubed on brides. Jasmine, rose, vetiver, tuberose, champaka, and frangipani filled Indian women's hair and clothing. The pre-wedding haldi ceremony, still practiced today, anointed brides and grooms with a paste of turmeric, sandalwood powder, rosewater, gram flour, milk, and saffron. It was simultaneously antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, and culturally protective against the evil eye. But India's great contribution to the history of fragrance was a technology, Attar, concentrated essential oil perfume captured through hydrodistillation in a copper apparatus called the deg and babka. Here is how it worked. Fresh flowers and water were sealed inside the deg, a large copper pot with a mixture of clay and cotton. Wood or cow dung fueled the fire underneath. Steam rose from the heated flowers, traveled through a hollow bamboo pipe called the chonga, and entered a copper receiver called the babka, sitting in a basin of cold water. Inside the babka sat sandalwood oil, not alcohol, because traditional Indian attar never uses alcohol. The sandalwood oil absorbed the flower essence as the steam condensed. The process took days. 1 kilogram of rose attar required between 4 and 6 tons of fresh rose petals. The center of this craft was, and still is, a city called Kannauj on the banks of the Ganges River. Its nickname is Attar Nagri, the perfume city. Production there dates at least to the 7th century, to the court of the Emperor Harshavardhana. In 2014, the Indian government gave Kannauj Attar a protected geographical indication, the same kind of legal recognition that champagne has in France. Kannauj's most extraordinary product is the one that sounds impossible until you understand the process. It is called Mitti Attar, earth perfume. Villagers collect clay from dried riverbeds, shape it into small disc-like shards, bake them in sun-heated kilns until they are hard and dry, and then load them into the copper deg. They distill the baked clay with water until the steam carries something almost unbelievable. The scent of monsoon rain striking parched ground. It is the only perfume in the world that captures the smell of earth itself, and it can only be made during the dry season. Once the monsoon arrives, the riverbed clay is too wet to bake. The greatest Indian perfume story belongs to the Mughal court. In the early 17th century, Empress Nur Jahan, the most influential woman in Indian history, a woman who had coins struck in her own name and who co-ruled the empire, was preparing a bath strewn with rose petals. The water was warm, and floating on its surface was a thin, iridescent film. Her mother, Asmat Begum, recognized it immediately. Pure rose essence, separated from the petals by heat. Emperor Jahangir, Nur Jahan's husband, recorded the discovery in his memoirs, the Tuzuk-i-Jahangiri. He wrote that this essence was of such strength in perfume that if one drop be rubbed on the palm of the hand, it scents a whole assembly. It restores hearts that have gone and brings back withered souls. Across the Himalayas, China had built a completely different relationship with scent. The Chinese character Xiang covers everything at once: fragrance, incense, spice, flavor. The Taoist principle was that every perfume is a medicine. Han Dynasty tombs contain magnificent bronze censers called Boshan Lu, shaped like the mythical Mount Penglai, the island of the immortals, with miniature beasts crawling up their slopes. Chinese imperial breath was sweetened with cloves, imported as early as 200 BCE from 5 tiny islands in the Indonesian Maluku archipelago. The Chinese name for cloves was Ji Shexiang, chicken tongue aromatic. Courtiers at the imperial palace were required to hold cloves in their mouths before speaking to the emperor. The Tang dynasty poet Song Jiwen reportedly carried cloves everywhere after Empress Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, allegedly refused his romantic advances because of his bad breath. Wu Zetian herself was obsessed with rare aromatics, particularly a substance called jiangzhengxiang, descending true fragrance. She demanded it in such quantities that her own ministers complained the empire's supply had been exhausted. The Tang dynasty aristocratic woman walked through the gardens of the capital city Chang'an, trailing clouds of sandalwood. Her clothes had been fumed over incense burners, her hair was piled in elaborate coils, and from her belt hung the single most ingenious perfume device ever created. It was a silver open-work sphere about the size of an apple, with a burning cup of aloes wood incense suspended inside on gyroscopic gimbals. The gimbals kept the cup perfectly horizontal no matter how the sphere was rolled, swung, or tucked inside bedclothes. The incense never spilled. The fragrance never stopped. Surviving examples were excavated from the underground chamber of the Famen Temple. They are over 1,000 years old and the mechanism still works. Under the Song dynasty, incense became one of the 4 cultured pursuits, ranked alongside tea, calligraphy, and painting. The way of incense, called Shangdao, was a meditative art form. The Song invented the incense stick. Scholars compiled at least 12 versions of treatises on incense appreciation. Women hung silk and gold sachets from their belts. And, in the Heian court of 11th century Japan, Lady Murasaki Shikibu's Tale of Genji describes incense blending contests between aristocratic women so refined that participants did not say they smelled the incense. They said they listened to it. But the single most consequential moment in the entire history of fragrance happened not in India or China. It happened in Baghdad, Damascus, Bukhara, and Cordoba during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Arab scientific revolution invented the modern distillation of essential oils. Without this invention, no Chanel No. 5, no Dior, no modern fragrance of any kind would exist. In the 8th century, an alchemist named Jabir ibn Hayyan, who served Caliph Harun al-Rashid, refined the alembic. That is the curving glass still whose name in every European language is a fossil of the Arabic word al-anbic. The alembic made controlled, large-scale distillation possible for the first time in history. A century after Jabir, the philosopher al-Kindi, working at the legendary House of Wisdom in Baghdad, wrote the Book of the Chemistry of Perfume and Distillations, 107 recipes for oils, salves, and aromatic waters. It was the first systematic perfumery manual ever written. Al-Kindi distinguished alchemy from chemistry and created the formula for Galia, a blend of musk, ambergris, ben oil, and aloes wood that became the signature scent of the Abbasid court. But the true breakthrough belongs to a Persian polymath from Bukhara named Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna. His canon of medicine shaped European pharmacy for 6 centuries, and around the year 1000 CE, Avicenna perfected the cooling coil of the alembic still, allowing steam to condense efficiently for the first time. He applied his improved apparatus to the damask rose. The result was modern rose oil and rose water. The technology that made every perfume bottle on Earth possible was born in a Persian laboratory 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years later, in the village of Kamsar, near the city of Kashan in Iran, villagers still perform the Golabgiri festival every May. They pick the Mohammadi rose at dawn and distill it in copper stills over mud and brick stoves using the same fundamental technique Avicenna refined. Kashan rose water is still shipped to Mecca to wash the Kaaba. The yield tells you everything about the value of this work. Roughly 2,000 petals make a single drop of essential oil. 4 to 6 tons of flowers produce 1 kilogram of attar. Arabian perfumery also gave the world oud. Agar wood, the dark, resinous heartwood of the Aquilaria tree, which forms only when about 2% of wild specimens become infected with a specific mold. The rest of the trees produce nothing. Oud was burned as bukur in a clay censer called the mibkara, and the smoke was passed under clothing and through hair. It is the Arab gesture of hospitality, still practiced at weddings and Friday prayers across the Gulf today. And then there was ambergris. The waxy substance from the digestive system of sperm whales, whose Arabic name, anbar, became the word amber in every European language. The Abbasid Caliph's own mother burned custom-blended musk and ambergris at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem every Friday. When Harun al-Rashid sent gifts to Charlemagne around 802 CE, the chests included silks, a brass candelabra, a water clock, a live elephant named Abul Abbas, and bottles of distilled rose water. Western Europe had never smelled anything like it. And what happened next, when that rose water arrived in a continent gripped by plague and miasma theory, would reshape European hygiene for 500 years. One of the most repeated myths in popular history is that medieval Europeans were filthy, unwashed, and surrounded by sewage. The truth is more complicated. Medieval people bathed regularly. Public bathhouses called stews in England, étuves in France, and Stuben in Germany were so common that Saint Bernard of Clairvaux could write, "Where all stink, no one smells." Hot pools, cold pools, mixed bathing, herbs scattered in the water. The early Middle Ages inherited much of this directly from Rome. Then came the Black Death. Between 1346 and 1353, the plague killed roughly a third of Europe. Medical authorities, working from a theory called miasma that blamed disease on foul air, decided that hot baths opened the pores and let sickness in. Bathhouses started closing. By 1526, the scholar Erasmus wrote that 25 years earlier, nothing had been more fashionable in Brabant than public baths. But the new plague had taught everyone to avoid them. Henry VIII shut down England's remaining public bathhouses by royal decree in 1546. In place of water, Europeans developed an elaborate system of dry hygiene. They changed their linen undergarments frequently, wiped their skin with cloths soaked in aromatic vinegar and rose water, and used scent itself to fight what they believed was the invisible poison in the air. This is exactly where the pomander enters the story. The word comes from the Old French pomme d'ambre, apple of amber, named for the ambergris at its center. It was a small sphere of gold or silver, perforated with tiny holes, hinged at its equator. Inside sat a paste of ambergris, civet, musk, benzoin, labdanum, storax, rosewater, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and dried flowers, cooked over a fire and molded by hand. Women hung pomanders from neck chains, belts, and finger rings. Cardinal Wolsey carried a clove-studded orange through plague-ridden London streets. In 1520, the Duke of Buckingham commissioned a gold pomander as a New Year's gift for Catherine of Aragon. It was perfume, status symbol, courtship token, and plague shield, all in one object the size of a walnut. Meanwhile, in monastery gardens across Europe, the knowledge survived. Hildegard of Bingen, abbess of Rupertsberg, from 1136, wrote 2 books describing 230 plants and their medicinal properties. On lavender, she wrote that whoever cooks it with wine, or with honey and water if they have no wine, and drinks it often lukewarm, it will alleviate pain in the liver and lungs and provide pure knowledge and a clear understanding. On evil spirits, she was even more direct. Lavender's smell clears the eyes, and evil spirits are driven out by it. Hildegard corresponded with 4 popes and invented her own language called lingua ignota. She was not dabbling. She was laying the foundation of European herbal medicine from inside a convent on the Rhine. And then, in 1370, came the invention that bridges the medieval world and the modern perfume bottle. Hungary water, Aqua Reginae Hungariae, was reportedly created for the elderly Queen Elizabeth of Hungary. The formula was rosemary distilled in brandy, sometimes joined by thyme, lavender, lemon balm, mint, and orange blossom. It was Europe's first known alcohol-based perfume. The legend claims the Queen was 72 years old, and after daily use, she was so restored that a 25-year-old Duke of Poland proposed marriage. Whether that part is true barely matters. The technology was real. Alcohol-based distillation was the turning point that would eventually make the modern perfume industry possible. While all of this was happening in Europe, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Civilizations that Europeans had never contacted were practicing a completely independent fragrance tradition, and a remarkably parallel one. In Mesoamerica, the resin of the bursera tree, called copal by the Aztecs and pom by the Maya, served exactly the same function that frankincense and myrrh served in Egypt and Arabia. This is not a metaphor. The Burseraceae family contains frankincense, myrrh, copal, and palo santo. The incense trees of both hemispheres are literal botanical cousins, separated by an ocean but used in almost identical ways. Aztec priests offered copal 9 times every day using long-handled ceramic ladles called telmitl, 4 times during daylight, 5 times through the night. The Aztec metaphor for poetry itself was in xochitl, in cuacatl, flower, and song. The gods, the Aztecs believed, did not eat their offerings. They fed on the scent. Aztec women perfumed themselves with frangipani, tuberose, and marigold, the flower that still covers altars on the Day of the Dead. The Emperor Moctezuma II maintained gardens at Huaxtepec planted entirely with flowers, among the earliest botanical gardens in recorded history. He drank chocolate flavored with vanilla, which the Aztecs called tlilxochitl, black flower, first cultivated by the Totonac people of the Gulf Coast and demanded as imperial tribute. The Florentine Codex, compiled by a Spanish friar with Nahua scribes in the mid-1500s, describes vanilla as of pleasing odor, fragrant, a precious thing, wonderful, marvelous. Across South America, Inca shamans burned Palo Santo, the holy wood, a Bursera relative whose heartwood is never harvested from living trees. Only naturally fallen wood, aged 4 to 10 years on the forest floor, is collected. The shamans of the Quero people teach that each piece of fallen Palo Santo houses an ancestral spirit. And across North America, indigenous nations practice smudging. Bundles of sage, sweetgrass, cedar, or tobacco burned for purification. With an abalone shell representing water, the plant representing earth, the flame for fire, and a feather wafting the smoke to represent air. Sweetgrass, called the hair of Mother Earth, was braided into the hair of Plains women. These were not perfumes in the European sense. They were ceremonies, medicine, prayer made visible. Across every one of these civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, the same handful of techniques kept appearing. Infusion in oil. Enfleurage, where fresh flowers were pressed into animal fat and replaced day after day until the fat was saturated, sometimes 30 rounds, sometimes 7,000 petals per batch, all by hand. Smoke-infusing fabric over incense burners, done in China, in Arabia, and in medieval Europe. And the 3 animal substances that made everything last. Ambergris, from the digestive systems of sperm whales, formed around squid beaks and aged for months, floating in open ocean. Musk harvested from a small gland on the abdomen of the Himalayan musk deer, and civet, scraped from the perineal glands of Ethiopian civets. By the 17th century, a pound of civet sold in Europe for 3 times the price of an enslaved man. These ingredients sound grotesque, but they were the molecular anchors. The macrocyclic ketones in musk and civet, the ambroxide in ambergris, did something no flower could do alone. They made perfume last. Without them, rose evaporates in an hour. With them, it lingers all day. Every culture, every continent, every century. Women invested enormous resources in scent. The question worth ending on is the simplest one. Why? The reasons interlock, and they repeat everywhere you look. Scent was the bridge to the divine. The Egyptian word for frankincense, senecher, literally translates as that which makes divine. The Latin perfumum, through smoke, gave English the word perfume. Christian incense in the Mass, Jewish anointing oil from Exodus, Bukur at Friday prayer, Aztec copal ladled to the 4 directions, Hindu sandalwood paste on a temple deity's brow. All of them share one belief: the gods smell good, and humans reach the gods through scent. Scent was medicine. From Hippocrates to the 1840s, Western medicine taught that disease traveled through bad air. Good smells, therefore, were protection. The pomander, the aromatic vinegar, Hungary water, kaifi, copal, palo santo, smudging, all were understood as pharmacy first and decoration second. Scent was status. Frankincense prophets carved Petra from sandstone. A pound of Roman perfume cost 2 years of a soldier's wages. Spikenard cost 300 denarii per pound. The exact price the Gospel of John attaches to the nard Mary of Bethany poured on the feet of Jesus. Scent was desire. The Song of Solomon reads like a coded inventory of aphrodisiacs. Greek courtesans used perfume as their primary professional tool. The myth of Phaon said Aphrodite gave an ugly ferryman a jar of scented ointment that made him irresistible. The magic was always in the perfume, and scent was identity. Long before the modern signature fragrance, a Babylonian queen's perfumer, an Egyptian pharaoh's incense priests, a Tang empress's aromatics master, a Mughal empress's Attar mixer, and an English noblewoman's stillroom mistress were all producing something deeply personal. A fragrance that announced who you were before you opened your mouth. The next time you pick up a bottle of perfume, remember what you are holding. It is the latest chapter of a 5,000-year-old craft built almost entirely by women. Tapputi mixed myrrh and balsam over an Assyrian fire in 1239 BCE. Egyptian women dripped lily oil from wax cones onto their shoulders at banquets in Thebes. Greek women rubbed mint on their arms and thyme on their knees. Roman women bathed in donkey milk and gladiator sweat. Indian women in Kanauj still distill the scent of monsoon rain in copper pots on the banks of the Ganges. Persian women in Kamsar still pick the Mohammadi rose at dawn in May. Aztec women crowned themselves in marigolds. Medieval European women hung gold pomanders from their belts. And one empress, named Nur Jahan, looked down at an iridescent film of oil floating on warm rose water and changed the world. What we call perfume today, a synthetic liquid in a glass bottle, is only the most recent version of a very old story. Before it existed, women had something arguably richer, a global, multicultural, deeply spiritual chemistry of scent that wove together botany, medicine, theology, art, trade, and desire. They wore frankincense from Arabia, sandalwood from Mysore, vanilla from Veracruz, rosewater from Kashan, lavender from monastic gardens, and the residue of squid beaks that had floated on the open ocean for years. They did not just smell good, they smelled like the world.